Hola YouTube, Capital G here. Today I want to talk about Kevin Thiebaut's top 32 Twilight deck from the YCS in France over this past weekend. This was probably the second most interesting deck to come out of the top tables of that event. So I figure I don't really need to spend time talking about Rabbit or Insectors or Windups at this point. You pretty much know what those decks look like. I'm really just trying to focus on the interesting and the unique decks that people have been successful at the YCS with. So first, let's go over the deck list. It's a Twilight deck. It's good to see Twilight is still alive and kicking. We've got 3 copies of Ryko, 2 copies of Lila, 2 copies of Wolf, 2 copies of Lumina, Arcus, 1 copy of Jane, 1 Aaron, 2 copies of Judgment Dragon, 1 copy of Honest, 2 copies of Chaos Sorcerer, 1 copy of BLS, 2 copies of Trigodia, 1 copy of Gores, 2 copies of Max C, 1 DD Crow, 1 Effect Veiler, 2 copies of Card Trooper, 2 copies of Necro Gardener, 1 copy of Plague Spreader, 1 copy of Spirit Reaper, 3 copies of Solar Recharge, 1 copy of Monster Born, 1 copy of Dark Hole, 1 charge of the Light Brigade, 1 Heavy Storm, 1 Pot of Avarice, and a Lure of Darkness. Okay, one of the first things that actually jumped out to me was actually not something in his main deck, but something that wasn't in his main deck. That was Mystical Space Typhoon. I kind of wondered how such an aggressive deck could get away with running basically no spell and trap removal in spell or trap form. This is probably because I think that some of the more intelligent players have come to realize that this engine right here, at its core, not just the Lightsworn engine, but I guess a condensed Lightsworn engine between Ryko and Lila. And you might start seeing that being an engine splashed into decks Ryko, Lila, Charger, Light Brigade, and maybe like a Solar Recharge or 2. It's so good. It kind of reminds me, it's like a boxer mentality where these cards right here, your Rykos and Lila, these are like jabs. And then basically these are just to whittle down your opponent's defenses. You don't really care about what your opponent has on the field because cards like Judgment Dragon and BLS and Chaos Sorcerer, they're going to remove just about anything your opponent has. Like, those are big ass boss monsters that say do not give a fuck. It doesn't matter what you have in front of them, it's going down. These are just the jabs. Then you come across with hooks, the JDs and the Chaos Sorcerers and BLSs. Those are what knock your opponent out. So you can actually start getting away with not having to run stuff like MST if you can consistently get, Lila and Ryko on the field and pick away your opponent's Solemn Warnings and their, Book of Moons and stuff like that. So you can open up your big plays, get the torrentials out of the way so that your heavy hitters can, really knock them out. And the thing about if you're running a full Lightsworn engine like this deck is, maybe unlike the other 2 decks, I mean, he's got full access to double Lumina. So don't think just because you killed a Lila that you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's fairly easy to get it back because Lumina's at 2 now. Ryko is also a card that, I mean, outside of if you have something like a Gemini Spark or a Skill Drain, I mean, Ryko is just a hard-ass card to stop. Even if you know it's coming, I mean, you can kind of mitigate some of the damage it does by maybe limiting your board. Like if you know your opponent has like Dragonfly Hornet, but outside of that, it's pretty difficult to stop Ryko, especially considering cards like Stardust don't really see that much play. I like his hand trap lineup. I mean, he basically ran everything under the sun from Trigodia to DD Crow to multiple Maxis to Effect Veiler. It seems like he just wanted to have all his bases covered. I look at this deck and I think, wow, how could he possibly not beat Dino Rabbit game 1 at least? Because, okay, Doka would probably be the death of this deck, but Logia is not doing shit to this deck. Let's just put it out there. You look at something like 3 copies of Ryko. Okay, those kill Logia. You've got Spirit Reaper. That stalls against Logia. All his boss monsters are bigger than Doka. I mean, it's like boss monsters left and right. If they attack into a Trigodia or a Gores, I mean, chances are those are going to be big enough to get over Logia. So this deck shouldn't have any problems at all handling Dino Rabbit, especially in game 1. And then you look at the side deck, you can side in things like Smashing Ground, which he probably did against Dino Rabbit game 2. So, when they bring out Doka, then you're covered on that aspect too. I may have liked to see a little more monster destruction in terms of his side deck for Doka, because again, I look at Doka, it could be a little bit of a problem with this deck. And I think that people are starting to realize that milling is something that's very difficult to answer in this game state right now. Like, milling is starting to become more popular because it's very hard to attack your opponent's options if they're not in their hand or on the board. I know that in previous formats it's become all the rage to keep your cards in your hand, i.e. hand traps. You know, why use negation on the field when you can use something like Max C, DD Crow, or Valor? You can negate from the hand stuff that can't be destroyed. But I mean, it kind of works from the graveyard too, doesn't it? I mean, you put big monsters on the field like the Shining or, you know, Lagia or Grapha or something like that, and your opponent just takes their monsters that they milled and they summon something like Chaos Sorcerer or BLS and they remove it, and you're kind of shit out of luck. So it's definitely good to see he had success in this deck. I can see why it's like Twilight has always been one of those decks where, since it runs a little bit of everything, it's very hard to pinpoint one exact way to beat it. I mean, it's hard to bulldoze the deck because you have things like Honest, you have things like Necro Gardener that stop attacks, which you can't really stop by conventional means. I mean, even the stall power that he has with something like Spirit Reaper or the random 2100s that he can put on the board just because he luckily hit them. You know, it's hard to focus on loading up your back row because I've talked about it in the beginning of the video. Cards like Lila and Raikou can pick apart your back row easily, and then if for some reason you happen to stop them, when they're dead, they just become fodder for even bigger threats like Judgment Dragon, BLS, and Chaos Sorcerer. So if you use all your removal trying to keep the regular Lightsworn monsters off the board, then you're going to have a serious problem when he starts dropping the big guns too. So yeah, he also has ways to recycle them with like Pot of Avarice. So don't think just because his BLS or his Chaos Sorcerer got milled that he can't get him back. I mean, he's not running Beckoning or anything like that, which you can't run because obviously he has so many darts. But cards like Pot of Avarice still put in work even if they're not really seen that much outside of like Wind Up and Dino Rabbit. I think that this is an interesting deck, and guys, I would say this, at your next regional or at even the YCS in Chicago, which I think is coming up fairly soon, you know, look for decks using the Lightsworn engine. Look for Charge of the Light Brigade to be a very popular card. Look for cards like Raikou and Lila to be everywhere, and don't think just because you have Light Mirror that you're going to stop the deck, because you have to look at it as a whole. I mean, most of these decks are running Chaos Sorcerer, they're running, you know, Plague Spreader, they're running a lot of Dart monsters, Gorge, Tragodia, so half the deck is still Dart, guys. Thank you for watching, click an ad, and I don't know, adios, guys.